For 72 seconds, the radio sky screamed, and it never happened again. One thin peak, one column of numbers and letters, which emerged from the noise like a bare rock out of the fog, 6EQUJ5. It has remained a single mark on paper and a long shadow in the memory of radio astronomy, a reminder that sometimes the universe speaks in whispers, and we have time to hear only one word and no more sound. August, Ohio. A huge stationary structure nicknamed Big Ear does not look at a specific point, but waits for the Earth's rotation to pull the sky through its narrow beam. This is patient astronomy, where each part of the firmament has its own short window. About a minute, a little more, from the first edge of the beam to the last, and if something gets in the way at that moment, a column of symbols will pop up on the printout. In a small laboratory, a printer hums, thin paper rustles, pencil notes in the margins. Project volunteer and astronomer Jerry Emmon is leafing through the usual pile of monochrome lines for those years and suddenly sees, in one column, numbers are replaced by letters, values grow like a heart rate on a monitor, and at the top point it is almost 30 sigma. The hand reaches for the handle, a spontaneous wow appears in the margins. This is how the legend began, and from a scientific point of view, the most disciplining question was born: what exactly crossed the beam of the Big Ear in such a way that it left a neat, beautifully designed trail and never happened again? To understand why this trace is so stubbornly held in memory, it is necessary to talk about the dry mechanics of recording. 6EQUJ5 is not a message or a code of civilization. This is an intensity scale according to adjacent timelines. The numbers are how much the signal has risen above the average noise in units of standard deviation. The letters continue the row, A, 10, B, 11, then alphabetically. In our column, the growth is in stages: 6, the letter E, then Q, then the top of U, that is, about 30 sigma above the noise, after the peak, a decline to J and then to 5. Such a profile indicates that the source entered the radiation pattern, passed through its center and exited, leaving behind the very symmetrical slide that the theory predicts for the transit passage. This is the first thing that makes the event interesting: the shape of time corresponds to the shape of the ray. The second is frequency. The signal sat next to the waterline of neutral hydrogen, around 1420 MHz. This region is called the water hole, a quiet corridor between the lines of hydrogen and hydroxyl radical, a place on the spectral map that physics itself identifies as a potential universal address. There is little natural noise, there is a clear landmark, and therefore many searches for technosignatures closely follow this particular strip. A narrow spike in such an area is not proof of artificial nature, but it is a red flag, a signal: check everything 3 times. The third and most disliked by everyone who loves simple answers is the geometry of the Big Ear. The telescope had 2 spaced horns, in fact, 2 neighbor beams. A stable source that shines for a long time would have to appear first in one, and after a short interval in the second. Our hero flared up in only one thing. It's as if you were walking past 2 open doors and heard a voice behind only one, even though the sound in the room should reach both equally. Such a detail frightens and disciplines at the same time. It scares because it breaks convenient stories like a lighthouse from space. It disciplines because it reminds us that interpretations must respond not to one spectacular fact, but to all at once. Then begins the boring but honest routine of science, an attempt to repeat. We looked there again and again, at the same coordinates, at close frequencies, on different instruments, in different seasons, under different ionospheres, with more sensitive receivers. Nothing like this was caught. This is not a sentence, but a diagnosis of data. We have one neat mark, one passage of the celestial sphere, one thin needle at the right frequency, and too little else to put together a solid puzzle. But even here you can see why the episode still lives in memory. It is both simple and stubborn. Simple, because everything fits into one look at the column of symbols. Stubborn, because other glances in the same place brought silence. There's another technical argument that makes wow especially tickling. Natural springs love width. Even when radiation occurs on a thin spectral line, the movement of the gas, rotation, temperature, turbulence swell it, the lines breathe and stretch. And here is an almost flawless, narrow carrier, like a tuning fork. With generators and transmitters, this happens naturally. Take support quartz, keep stability, you will get a beautiful thread on the spectrum. Nature is also possible, but not so easy. Therefore, the puzzle takes shape. We see a time profile that looks like a neat transit through a beam, we observe a narrow needle at a universal frequency, and at the same time we are faced with the absence of a second beam and a repeat. The perfect mixture to argue endlessly. As soon as a single line appears in science, the first duty is to decompose the versions. Earth interference. Radio frequency junk is the eternal pain of radio astronomy. But domestic, technical, and ground-based sources have a character. They tend to repeat themselves, jump in lanes, simultaneously climb into neighboring channels, and respond to the operating cycle of equipment. It is possible to get into a protected water area, pass with a transit profile, and then never show up again, but this version becomes as long as a train of assumptions. Satellites. If it were a flyby of the spacecraft, we would most likely see frequency drift from relative motion, or a repeat on an adjacent orbit, or find a documentary lead. A reflection from a metal fragment, an airplane, an accidental hair of the ionosphere. It is possible to draw a geometry in which a narrow tone flashes for a fraction of a minute, but then it is more difficult to explain why the second ray was silent and why no related burst was found later. Comets with a hydrogen corona that were once offered as an explanation. It's beautiful on paper, hydrogen is it, frequency is it. But the hydrogen in the comet envelope is diffuse and weak, and we need a needle, and the celestial mechanics did not converge cleanly enough with the coincidence of time and position there. Each option can be pulled separately, but as soon as you impose all the conditions at once, narrowband, frequency, transit shape, single beam, lack of repetition, simple explanations begin to fall apart at the seams. For the sake of fairness, it should also be said about the opposite. Artificial nature is not a password word, not a magic card that closes a dispute. This is also a set of requirements. Repeatability, at least sometimes. Predictable frequency drift corresponding to the relative motion of the source. Polarization that bears the signature of technology, not random plasma chaos. Modulations are not just load-bearing, but a structure by which you can distinguish a stone from an architecture. Localization that would allow you to shoot there next time with a narrow beam already with bone analysis. So far, we have only a beautiful column of sixes and letters, the honest answer remains the same, unknown. And yet, a single mark taught an entire generation of radio astronomy good manners. First, check the candidate simultaneously in several places. Today, when a narrow needle appears at an interesting frequency, they try to confirm the signal immediately with independent antennas in order to shoot local interference. Secondly, do not be content with averaging. Raw data, arrival times, small drift details, all this is now tried to be saved so that you can go back and look at the same data in the face from a different angle. Third, think dynamically. A signal is not a point, but a trajectory. It must breathe frequency. If the source is moving, it can rotate the plane of polarization. If it passes through the medium, its structure can give out the way it is generated. And finally, spectrum sanitation, strict catalogs of local transmitters, filtering, blacklists of frequencies, where the chance of catching household appliances is high, and white windows, where nature is quieter. You can also arrange mental gymnastics, without fanaticism, just to test your inner consistency. Let's imagine an ultranarrow beam, a rare mode of operation, long pauses between switch-ons. The Earth is a tiny target. We do not listen to the sky all the time, and even more so in the 70s. One successful crossing of trajectories, and we get the same 6EQUJ5 column, where the rise to peak and decline draw a passage through the radiation pattern, and the second ray is silent because the inclusion ended before the source reached the next door. It is also possible to imagine a byproduct of some technology, rather than the beacon itself, as a reflected overtone, a thin thread next to the main process, accidentally caught in our ray. Neither of these scenarios proves anything, but both allow us to see that the hypothesis of artificiality is not a romantic gesture, but a construct that can and should be tried to falsify. Meanwhile, practice has learned another important trick: not to fall in love with candidates. Today's projects structure the work in such a way that the check takes not months, but seconds. An alarm needle appears on one receiver, and almost immediately others look there, in another city, on another continent. If it's quiet everywhere, they record, archive, and move on. If it coincides, heavy artillery begins, drift measurements, attempts to catch the structure, turning telescopes with narrower beams, playing on polarization, trying to track whether the flare is related to the activity of the star, to a plasma event, to something that nature already knows how to produce. This routine is the most honest part of the wow story. It didn't give us an answer, but it gave us habits that will make us lose less next time. And yet, somewhere in the middle between romance and skepticism, there is a simple human emotion. One day you are sitting over numbers, and suddenly a column grows out of the background, similar to a perfect teaching example. It arises where any sane SETI textbook would say, "Look here." At a pure frequency, with a beautiful shape, without dirt in neighboring channels. And disappears forever. You can get angry at this elusiveness, you can be ironic, but it's better to take it for granted. The universe is not obliged to talk to us in convenient sentences. Sometimes she throws a single word and waits to see if we can build a method around it. The awkward detail with the two-beam scheme of the big ear makes you return to geometry again and again. If the source has lived less than the distance in time between passages through two horns, we naturally see only one. If the lag between the rays is longer than the duration of the flash, the second one simply has no chance. This doesn't automatically save any of the versions, but it does show how sensitive our outputs are to the tool's settings. A lot of this story is about the grid through which we sew: frequency step, channel width, integration time. Change the grill and the event would look different. We caught exactly the shape and clarity that the settings allowed. Nothing more. Over the years, a belt of secondary legends has grown around WoW. From conspiracy theories to almost poetic. But if you remove the husk, there will be a modest and very adult morality. Astronomy is not a collection of miracles, it is a technology of doubt. Good stories survive here only when they are stretched through a sieve of repetition, independent checks, boring tables. Wow! Went perfectly halfway through, it is still exciting, because it does not violate its own facts and does not allow itself to be easily written off. And it also rests against the wall, because it did not bring what makes hypotheses adult: the second time, the second door, the second data binding. This does not make any less sense to listen further. On the contrary, it becomes clearer exactly how to listen. Forget about romantic radio sessions all at once. We need well-thought-out campaigns, narrow windows where physics favors, distributed networks, where one receiver ensures the other, archives of raw packages so that you can count what seemed empty. We need algorithms that see not points, but trajectories, distinguish frequency breathing from device breathing, and take weak modulations out of noise. We need the willingness to publish not only successes, but also failures, so that the next person who hears a similar needle compares with ours nothing found and buys time. We do not know what flew through the beam in August of that distant year. We know what it looked like in our grid of measurements, we know why simple earthly explanations are stalling, and we know what we're missing to say the word proven. Sometimes this is enough. It is enough not to build a church on a single column and at the same time not to kick a sign just because it has not become a door. It is enough to continue, calmly, persistently, without sensations and without cynicism. And if tomorrow a thin needle flashes again somewhere at the water frequency, we will have more tools and fewer illusions. We will check faster, doubt smarter, publish more carefully. And even if there is only one word left, this is also progress. Because the method learns to hear silence not as emptiness, but as a pause between two meanings. Sometimes it seems that the hardest thing in this story is not the lack of an answer, but the temptation to embellish it. The brain loves to draw, catches familiar shapes in noise, and wants to believe that a thin needle at a universal frequency was someone's conscious choice. But fairness to data requires a reverse movement: remove the superfluous, leave only what survives rechecking. On white paper, there remains a discrete truth about how exactly we listened. The grid of frequency channels, the step in time, the bandwidth, all these are lenses that do not just show the world, but take a picture of it with their own optics. In the 70s, such lenses were coarser, slower electronics, larger pixels of the spectrum, heavier archive. Hence our main deficit: we lack raw records that could be recounted, scrolled with a different step, to see if the frequency breathes, whether polarization behaves the way technology, not plasma, behaves. If you listen to the frequency itself, it becomes clearer why there is so much philosophy around it. The hydrogen line is almost like a road sign on a sky map. Between it and the hydroxyl lines lies that very quiet corridor, a water hole, where there are fewer natural cries, and there is more universal meaning. Any civilization, even one that is not like us, can come to the idea that this address is heard by everyone. Therefore, a narrow needle in this place inevitably plays on our strings. But nature does not have to make noise randomly. There are subtleties in the rays of galaxies and in the shells of nebulae that from time to time pretend to be order. Too often, we learn this in hindsight when the instrument deploys higher clarity, or when the next generation of receivers finds a new familiar focus in nature. This is another reason to stick to modest tactics, instead of slogans, daily hygiene of the spectrum, instead of loud marks, patience and archive. There is an honest way to talk to such a riddle without losing dignity. Imagine that you are a doctor who saw a rare symptom for the first time, and not run to the stage, but call your colleagues and get a card. You record the temperature and pulse of the signal, record how quickly it rises and falls, note exactly where it stings on the frequency scale and where it is silent, and most importantly, make sure that many years later another doctor can open your recording and hear the same thing in his headphones. This is how a method grows from a single word. And when we say unknown, it's not capitulation, it's a protocol that gives the next observer a chance to be smarter than we are. Sometimes I imagine that moment as a scene with two doors. Behind the first there is a voice, for the second there is silence, and you stand between them, realizing that there is no turning back, and there is nowhere to go forward yet. This feeling gives a strange calmness. It teaches you to listen not only to the loud, but also to the form of silence around. If the flash had been wider in time, if the integration had been shorter, if the channels had been narrower, if someone had been looking at the same point at the same time with another receiver, we would know more today. But we know enough not to deceive ourselves. We know that one ray could make it, and the other could not. We know that a narrow carrier at the right frequency does not look like household dirt. We know that nature likes to spray, not draw hairs. And we know that one day, when the instrument and discipline coincide, a similar episode will not be a legend, but the beginning of a long dialogue. The longer you look at this story, the clearer you see it as a master class in modesty. There are no lone heroes in it who reveal the mystery of the universe in one fell swoop. There are people here who know the value of silence. They put aside the beautiful words, take out a pencil and draw a neat diagram. Here is the ray, here is the time, here is the frequency, this is where we are sure, this is where the doubt is. And if tomorrow a narrow needle flashes again somewhere on the sky map, they will do the same, only better. They will be ready to catch confirmation before making up stories. They will put the data in an open archive before writing manifests. They will ask their neighbors across the ocean, have you heard? And wait for an answer, even if they really want to shout yes. It is easy for us to love riddles for their understatement, but it is much more difficult to love a method that, step by step, leaves alive only that which can withstand cold light. Wow! is a rare example of a thing that manages to be beautiful, useful, and honest at the same time. Beautiful because it has an amazing coincidence of form, frequency, and silence. Useful because it forced us to rebuild practices, learn synchronous confirmations, store sources, and automate doubt. Honest, because from the very beginning it did not pretend to be an answer, but was only a well-designed question. Maybe that's why it lives so long, not as a sensation for one evening, but as a tool that does not rust. When we turn off the lights in the control room and are left alone with the night air, it becomes especially clear how much science rests on the discipline of silence. There is no shame in putting stones back if they do not fold into a bridge. In the same way, there is no shame in loving a riddle and at the same time keeping it at arm's length until the second stone appears. And if it ever appears, if another thin needle flashes in the same place or next to it and passes through the same doorways, we will be ready. We will have not only delight, but also a plan. We will put a second antenna next to the first, a third one 1,000 kilometers away, and a fourth one on another continent. We will catch drift, remove polarization, check neighboring frequencies and capture every second. We will let the world look at it with us, not for the sake of likes, but for the sake of calm confidence that this time we did everything right. And maybe then the word that once flashed on paper will turn out to be not a lonely exclamation, but the first syllable of a long phrase. And if not, if there is only a moment and a pause again, we will still be richer. Because they learn to hear pauses as part of music, not as a failure. Because they realize that an honest we don't know is not a void, but a space for the next precise step. Because they accepted that star radio sometimes speaks at such a speed that you need to grow up to with your instrument and character. This means that we have something to do tomorrow. If you dig deeper into the mechanics themselves, it becomes clear why these 72 seconds sound like a small test of adulthood. Imagine a narrow spotlight that is not guided by the hands, but left motionless, and the whole scene itself floats through its beam. The Earth rotates, and any part of the sky passes through a scheduled radiation pattern, like a train through a station where there are no long stops. At the beginning there is a quiet hint, then an increase towards the center, a peak at the very moment of the coincidence of the axes, and a smooth departure. This is exactly what the column of symbols looked like a training curve for a transit source. Hidden inside this simple drawing is the main prick. If we saw a perfect passage once, why didn't we catch it with a second horn a few minutes later, when the same patch of sky was supposed to slide through the next door? The answer may be trivial, the spring could live less than the interval between doors, but it doesn't make it any easier. In science, banal answers enter only with evidence. We sorely lack the subtle details of that episode, which are filmed automatically today. Frequency drift, a tiny diagram of how many hertz per second is taken away by relative motion, a polarization signature, a hint of modulation, all these are markers by which technology is quickly distinguished from nature. An exoplanet, together with its star, inevitably pulls the transmitter on microscopic speed increments, and therefore on a small but fixed on the neckline of inclination at the waterfall of the spectrum. Modern searches chase hundreds of drift hypotheses and straighten possible tilts to see if the needle folds into a vertical thread under the correct assumption of motion. Back then, in the 70s, we worked rougher, the integration is longer, the channel is wider, there is almost no raw data archive, only a neatly averaged column. It is beautiful as a poster, but cold as evidence. You see the form, but there are no details. In this whole story, it is easiest to get carried away by the romance of a universal frequency, but it is much more useful to notice how it has transformed common sense. Between the hydrogen line and the hydroxyl lines lies a quiet corridor where there is less natural noise. A logical idea: if someone ever decides to leave the lighthouse, they will think about an address that everyone will see. We humans have come up with this logic for ourselves, and it is quite possible that somewhere else in the universe we have already invented it. But science does not survive on quite possibly. She survives on inspections. So instead of building legends, we built a method, where a thin needle sounds, confirmation should come from several independent ears at once. The second one could not hear it, it was already an alarm bell. It is not heard by the third on another continent, it means that this is either local dirt, or a clear but brief thing with which you should not rush to loud words. The past decades have provided a good contrast. We have learned to see flashes of a completely different nature, fast radio bursts with a different signature, a wide band, and strange repetition in some sources. It turned out that the universe can speak in different voices, and some of them we simply could not distinguish before because of the settings. This has a sobering effect on the imagination. Instead of falling in love with an old needle, we expand our hearing, build networks that simultaneously hold different ranges and compare results almost without delay. We learn the discipline of coincidences. 1 receiver is a candidate, 2 is an intrigue, 3 is a conversation about a case. We learn to store raw in order to recalculate with a new grid in a year and suddenly hear not a point, but a whole trajectory. The most sobering thing in this story is the sense of proportion. 1 mistake with conclusions is enough to sink trust for years. We have already seen how innocent household appliances made a noise similar to an astronomical signature, and how, after a while, it turned out that a miracle was born in the kitchen. This is not a reason to cynically wave your hand at everything unusual, this is a reason to dress every unusual thing in a vest of inspections. A narrowband peak on the right frequency is a ticket to a long corridor, not a key to the safe. And in this corridor, the doors are opened only by bundles, repetition, independence, physical coherence, transparent archive. If you replace at least one bundle with beautiful words, you are back in the waiting room, where trains do not run. When you look at WoW, like a mirror, you can see ourselves in it. We see how willingly the brain completes the picture, how quickly the contours of history are born, how easy it is to imagine a thin lighthouse that licked the earth once. And we see how the craft works in practice, chart calculations, boring frequency tables, filtering protocols, interference accounting. This does not kill the miracle, but makes it sustainable. If one day we have a second episode, similar in form and frequency and confirmed by several eyes at once, it is these boring things that will allow us not to argue about style, but to deal with the essence. Sometimes it is useful to slow down and unfold that column of symbols in the mind, like a film under the light. 6, E, Q, U, J, 5, growth, peak, decline, about 30 sigma at the top, narrow strip, the right place on the spectrum. Then emptiness. What can we do about such a drastic incompleteness? Put the facts in boxes, sign each one, it is consistent with transit, yes, agrees with the second horn, no, narrowband, yes, stable repetition is not. And, looking at these signatures, accept that the logical ending is not a contact sign, but an unknown sign. An unpopular word for loud thumbnails, but the only one that doesn't break bridges behind your back. There is also a human side. Somewhere in this story, there is a person who circled a column with a pencil and wrote wow. This is not a weakness, but an honest emotion to meet a rare pattern. Science does not require killing emotions, she demands to put them in their place. Emotion is at the beginning, method is at the end. And when you return to that paper years later, you want to say thank you for an honest gesture, underlined, did not hide, did not embellish with superfluous, gave the next generation a reason to argue and train. There is nothing more practical than a neatly designed question. Nowadays, such a question has specific addressees. Large dishes with wide receiving paths, arrays that listen simultaneously from different points, algorithms that sift through billions of narrow needles and look for something in them that does not behave like familiar garbage. We arrange schedules so that a suspicious peak can be illuminated with other eyes within minutes, not weeks, and so that regardless of the outcome, there is an archive for those who will come tomorrow. We add context, what the nearest star was doing at that moment, what the atmospheric sensors showed, whether there was an electronics festival in the city nearby, whether there was a radar somewhere nearby. Each such little thing removes the layer of uncertainty and makes the unknown shorter and denser. And when someone asks again, was that it? The most honest answer still sounds like a restrained smile. It was a beautiful coincidence of form, frequency, and silence. It was not repeated and was not confirmed by the second ray. It has taught us to listen better and doubt faster. It remains the most famous question written down on thin paper, and there is no tragedy in it. The tragedy would be to stop listening because of one unanswered question. We, on the contrary, spread our ears wider, made them cleaner and taught ourselves to say we don't know so that it means ready to learn. Still, the most important part of the lesson is how a single mark makes you fix the entire path of the signal from the sky to the number on paper. The beam passes through the sky, but then the workshop work begins, the primary receiver, the local oscillator, filters, amplifiers, the analog-digital part, the channeling into frequency boxes and, finally, the algorithm that converts the amplitudes into those very symbols. At each step, a bird may appear, a parasitic tone, guidance, intermodulation, harmonic of a local generator, a side whisper of a neighboring path. Therefore, it is good practice not just to see the needle, but to be able to ask direct questions to the tracks. What exactly could give you a narrow tone here, at this particular time, of exactly such duration and shape? The longer the industry lives with such a question, the thicker its service event logs are. Who turned on the transmitter on the neighboring mast, when the waveguides were blown, where the power was changed in the building, when the local supporters were last tested. On the side of the sky, the questions are not simpler. We're used to thinking of frequency as a point, but the real signature is dynamics. The Earth spins and flies in orbit, and even if the source is stationary in the galactic sense, for us its tone breathes a little, the frequency slowly slides in one direction and returns in the other, and this breath is measurable. At frequencies of about 1420 MHz, the daily carousel gives neat tenths of a hertz per second of possible drift, nothing for a musician, but gold for a radio physicist. Modern researchers do not wait for the drift itself to zero, they straighten hundreds of hypothetical slopes of the dynamic spectrum and see in which of them the signal turns from an inclined thread into a vertical one. This is a simple trick that dramatically increases the chance of distinguishing a real breath from a device that has drift of a completely different nature. The historical episode with the paper printout did not have such luxury. The grid is coarser in time, larger in frequency, and no well recalculate tomorrow. Raw tapes were not stored, they were replaced by averaging. It is especially clear here why the protected range is not a magic shield, but only a request for peace. The windows around the hydrogen line are legally covered so that radio astronomy can work, but the world is not perfect. Leaks, mirror channels, nonlinearities can push the tone where it doesn't seem to be. That is why the coincidence of several independent ears is valued. If only one antenna sees the tone, it is a mystery. If two are far from each other, this is an argument. If there are three or more, and even on slightly different routes, this is already a conversation that everyone is happy to join. We know from other stories how insidious false miracles can be. Suffice it to recall how one strange quasi-flashes in the radio range turned out to be the door of a microwave oven, which someone opened a little before it turned off the magnetron. It's not funny, it's instructive. You need to check not only the sky, but also the building and people's habits. At the other end of the scale, we are tempted to animate the episode with a beautiful fantasy. A narrow beam of incomprehensible technology, which is rarely turned on, a side tone from something huge that we don't understand, an alien tuning fork at the address, which physics itself burned on the sky map. All of these pictures have a right to exist as long as they obey discipline. They must predict observable things and not collapse at the first attempt to reaffirm themselves. Didn't work out. It doesn't matter, a good hypothesis can die quietly, leaving a set of tests on the table that will be useful to the next one. This is how the community's immunity to beautiful delusions is built, not by bans on imagination, but by the habit of driving any story through specific ifs. In this sense, wow is almost perfect laboratory work on the craft of doubt. It teaches how to plan surveillance so that the candidate has nowhere to hide. Multi-frequency coverage, to understand whether it is a single needle or the habit of an object to sound on several notes at once. Polarization is to distinguish the mechanism in which the electric field spins the way technology likes, from the environment in which the rotation of polarization is dictated by plasma and magnetic fields. Rapid reorientation of antennas, to turn seams into yes or no in minutes. An archive of raw data so that tomorrow, in a year, and in 10 years, someone will be able to squeeze the grid and find in a familiar shadow what today's algorithms were not yet able to see. Finally, openness, so that the world participates not in rumors, but in checks. You publish not a poster, but data, and ask, try to break my interpretation. A special theme is the second ray, this innocent detail that has been making you return to geometry for decades. When we say the beam did not see, we do not mean the whim of the device, but cold kinematics. The radiation pattern is only a fraction of a degree wide, and if the flash lives less than the window between the passages, the second door simply didn't stand a chance. Add to this that the top of the first door came neatly to the center, and you get a strict fork. The source had to be either very short, or so narrow and geometrically precise that any everyday version turns into a circus exercise. It is this fork that keeps the interest in the episode alive. Every simple story breaks something important, and complex stories do not like to live on a single paper column. Therefore, the real value of an episode is not in what it proves, but in what it forces. It forces you to store more than it seems necessary today, because tomorrow the extra will become critical. It forces us to design observations not as a romantic we listen to everything, but as an engineering experiment with control and experimental arms. It forces us to build the habit of saying we don't know not as a reply, but as a route. This is what we will learn if it happens again. Here are the marks we will remove first. This is how we will divide the labor between the antennas. That's where we'll put the data. This is how a single word turns into a plan for years. There is also an unexpected, almost artistic side to this restraint. It's changing the way we tell stories about space. Instead of a convenient fairy tale with an ending, we get a long breath of the process, where it is not the clue that is valued, but the way to live with the riddle without breaking tools and heads. It's less televised, but much more honest to reality. And the paradox is that such honesty ultimately makes cinema stronger. A viewer who has seen how carefully you separate facts from hypotheses, how calmly you admit limitations, how you prepare a test for tomorrow trusts you 10 times more than a viewer who has once again been promised finally a clue. Of course, no one is immune from mistakes. Someday we will say too much, underestimate the dirty path, overestimate the beauty of the needle. But the more often we drive ourselves through this methodical corridor, the less often we will fall. And if one day a needle flashes again somewhere on the water frequency, this time in several places at the same time, with beautiful drift, clear polarization, and a preserved raw track, we will be able to afford a little more emotion. We'll be able to say it looks like yes, not as dreamers, but as people who did all the boring work before they turned on the music. Until that moment, we have to do what good science does best, preserve silence so that the next word can fall in it. Write understandable protocols so that years later no one will argue about where the antenna stood and how the receiver breathed. Make diagrams simple and conclusions short. Pull the net so that rare fish do not slip out between the cages. And the main thing is not to confuse the beauty of the needle with the obligation of the universe to be Hamlet at our first request. Sometimes she says one word once every 40 years. And the only reasonable reaction is to make sure that next time we hear two. And here is the most honest conclusion. We're still on the same frequency band where a single 6EQUJ5 column once flashed, but today we have different tools, different discipline, and different patience. The silence, which then seemed like a sentence, now sounds like a pause between phrases. We have learned not to fill it with fantasies, but to clear it for the next word, to fix drift instead of assumptions, to catch polarization instead of emotions, to store raw data instead of beautiful legends. And this is perhaps the main gift of that moment from 1977, a single peak turned into a school line by which we test our own illusions. If tomorrow a thin needle flashes again somewhere in the water corridor, it will have a place to land, independent ears on other continents, cold algorithms that first try to break the hypothesis, and only then agree to tolerate it, an archive open to the world for everyone to see for themselves. And if the needle does not catch fire, it doesn't matter either. We will continue to increase sensitivity, narrow the grid, shorten integrations where necessary, and lengthen them where it is more important to pull the weak seams of space out of the noise. We will recognize where the instrument goes blind and fix this blindness. We will divide the sky among ourselves, as people walking along the glacier share the route, a short bundle, reliable knots, a minimum of unnecessary words. I like to think that an honest we don't know is not a dot, but a dotted line leading further. Wow! Is a beautiful, well-crafted question that has survived decades precisely because it didn't pretend to be an answer. He made us grow up. He has weaned us from confusing a narrow line at the right frequency with the obligation of the universe to be obedient to our plot. He taught us to love not sensations, but careful procedures, in which trust is born. And if someday a second column of symbols appears next to that column of symbols, confirmed, res hot, measured from different sides, we will hear in silence not a miracle, but the beginning of a conversation. In the meantime, let's leave this story as it deserves to be, strict, clear and unembellished. There was a narrowband spike where physics suggests a universal address. It passed through the first ray as the real source should pass, and did not come through the next door. He could not be caught again, despite many years of trying. Simple versions do not close everything at once without stretches, complex ones require data that we do not have. This means that the answer is honest and adult, we don't know. And this is normal. If you are close to this way of looking at space, without horror stories and without easy endings, but with respect for the facts, support this approach. Like, subscribe, turn on the bell, this allows you to do more long and accurate analysis. In the comments, write which version seems to you the most workable with the current data and which test you would put first if tomorrow we saw a new candidate in the same range. I will leave links to materials and reports in the description so that you can go through the chain yourself and check everything again. This is how trust is built, when anyone can repeat the steps. We will continue to listen. Without expectation of a miracle and without fatigue, with a cool head and a warm respect for the unknown. Because sometimes the most important phrases begin with a pause. And if this pause is called 6EQUJ5, then the best tribute to it is to keep the channel clean, the tools ready and the pride off. When the word is spoken, we will hear it. Until then, there is silence that works for us.